afternoon forward. Thank you, Samir. Thank you, Minister Sitharaman, for being here with us at the Raisina Dialogue. Thank you to the audience for being here. Let me get straight to the point because we're dealing with a no-fuss minister who gets to the point straight away. So, ma'am, first question straight away. You've been presenting budgets since 2019 when you became Finance Minister. You will go down in history as the Finance Minister who's faced the greatest challenges. Each of your budgets was designed perfectly or for a certain eventuality, and then you had first the pandemic, then the supply chains crisis caused by Ukraine. On each occasion, you had to go back to the drawing board, sometimes mid-year. Yet, through all of this, the Indian economy has emerged very stable. In fact, things are looking up and looking optimistic. How did we do this? What did we do right over these two shocks? And what lessons have we learned?
I don't know if I'll have the time to elaborate, but then what did we do right? I think it is because at every level, beginning from the Prime Minister down to the secretaries in the department, all of us were constantly in contact with people who would give us inputs of how we need to respond to this developing situation. So that is, I think, one of the obvious point which I can refer to as reason why the way in which we responded to the pandemic, way in which we responded to the necessity for sustaining growth have all worked out. It is because we've, I think, heard people saying what they want from us and what is it that which is causing pain, and therefore the reflection on that and the resultant policy has enabled our response to be more purpose-serving. So that I would think is the simple answer for this question.
Great. Ma'am, our second question. We've seen, as I said, great turbulence in the first 3 years of the 2020s. Perhaps some turbulence will come back in this decade, one can't predict. Yet there's a lot of hope riding on India and within India. 20 to 25% of global growth in the rest of this decade will emerge from India. To be honest, as you've known with your long career in public life, we've seen such optimism before in India in the early 2000s, and then those hopes after a certain period were belied. What makes us more confident this time of a more sustained growth? What have we got right this time?
Well, several factors. The global situation. We seem to have the right combination of things which matter for a growing economy. Good, well-trained youth, we can have them better trained. A middle class which itself gives you a captive market. A middle class which has a certain purchasing power in its hand, it can be even more. Technology and technology-driven public investment, giving public products which are being used for health, education, transport, or even financial sector, payments and so on. So public infrastructure in the digital world, and also, well, oft repeated but very understated when you finally really make up the factors that play in India's favor. Rule of law. We do have an elected democracy, a well-established common law, and also our courts. You can keep highlighting the fact that delayed justice, time taken for justice and so on, but systems exist and transparently at that. There is no somewhere somebody suddenly arresting somebody and taking them inside. He's the head of a corporate, big corporate, and he disappears for some time and then he appears. None of that happens here. You can speak against the government. You can speak against the government, you can speak against the Prime Minister, but then you're there to do your business. So there are no picking you up and disappearing from the world. None of that happens. Business is respected for what they do, and more and more facilitation for business to feel at ease to do its work. And now I wouldn't get into this argument of, probably the center is doing, states are not. No, states are also doing it fast. Many of them are really getting into this race of saying, is my state attractive enough? Are we alluring enough for investments to come and so on? So I think various factors all put together into the India basket now certainly looks as that destination which people, if they had missed it for other shores earlier, is on now. And I would recall, there are several ministers who I'd like to quote here who had been part of the G20. But even before coming to the G20, Secretary Yellen very clearly spoke of friendshoring. Being in Delhi with the in a press conference alongside me, she talked about friendshoring. All this indicates that India is today the destination where businesses should come for obvious reasons.
Minister, you spoke about G20, and that leads me to my next question. India is in the midst of the G20 presidency, and at the core of the G20, as you know, is the finance track. India has positioned itself as a sort of bridge between the countries of G20 and the countries of the global south. Now, from your vantage position, what does this mean in practice? And at the recent G20 finance ministers' meeting in Bangalore or Bengaluru, how sensitive were G20 countries to the concerns, the indebtedness, the economic travails of the global south?
In fact, I must say in G20, the debt vulnerability, the debt-related stress of small economies, low-income countries, middle-income countries, was a matter taken with all seriousness, and there weren't any difference of opinion. In fact, I would take this opportunity to say, if the G20 finance track and later, of course, the foreign ministers track also couldn't come up with a communique, it's because a communique is released only when all the issues are agreed upon by all of them. And except for one issue, in fact, the finance ministers track had about 17 paragraphs. 15 of them were agreed to. Only 2, but 2 relating to one issue, and that is the war. There wasn't a unanimity, and 2 countries had different viewpoints. But on which we are talking now, about India being the voice of the South, about issues relating to the South, global South. I take the example of debt, the debt-related stress, as one item on which there was complete unanimity, because the common framework under which debt-related issues are handled by the IMF, for instance, one issue which really worried everybody before coming to G20, that is, was the delay. Countries apply for a restructuring and then they wait for years, and some of them even get out because of the sheer frustration that it's not moving fast enough. But the others who are waiting, wait for the debtors to come on the table at the same time so that they can get a restructuring done and so on. But on that, the G20 was one. There was no difference of opinion. And India was able to convince that we need to deal with the low-income countries, and took the example of a few middle-income countries which are also on debt-related stress. And I'll name the country, one of them, Sri Lanka, on which we have, because India is the governor also for representing Sri Lanka in the World Bank and in IMF. So we did take up that case earlier, and even on Sri Lanka, there was complete unanimity that we have to deal with debt-related stress issues very early, as early as it is required. The other one point, without taking much time, is India, and we all know that Honorable Prime Minister has been speaking about how multilateral institutions need reform. And when we say multilateral institutions, they include World Bank and others, which are all dealing with development issues and funding of development issues. On that, India proposed to have an expert panel look at those issues which are so important for making these multilateral development institutions ready for 21st century challenges. They are 20th century products, but even to maximum leverage the funds that they have as it is, and to also have the skill to be able to raise funds from the market, so that in total they have enough pool of resources with which they can fund development aspirations of the global south, is a big issue on which Prime Minister has been already speaking severally. But we appointed an expert panel. We suggested let them go into the details so that these institutions can quickly, on an agreed roadmap, be reformed. There was complete support on that agenda as well. So, Voice of the South, India is putting across the voice of the South, and therefore issues concerning the South are being taken up in the G20.
I'd like to stick with the G20 for one more question, because this is after all the G20 year. In a sense, we are in a period of the G20 when the global South is becoming, or developing countries are becoming very important. Indonesia, India, Brazil, soon South Africa, this cohort of developing nations will change the character and the conversation at G20. We have a war in Europe which is regrettable and caused in February 24, but it has sucked a lot of energy from the global system. It has distorted supply chains. It has caused pain. Whoever is to blame, I don't want to go into that. Can the developing countries' agenda find enough space on the G20 agenda, on the global agenda, I would say, in the midst of this turbulent geopolitics?
I think yes, and it is finding space. There is no grudge saying why should this come up or why is it relevant at all, none of that. And there is definitely enough time and discussion carrying on those agenda. The one issue which probably will answer the previous question and this one as well is at the peak of the pandemic, during Italian presidency, there was this high-level task force appointed for looking at health and finance, looking at financing any future pandemic, and earlier before that also to finance the current pandemic, which was 2020 pandemic. So Italy had kept up the momentum, so did Indonesia before us, and it was resolved that there will be a pandemic fund created for countries who are just not able to move with funding their prevention or even attending to the pandemic if it has hit. So the pandemic fund was created, and that continues now, and we have taken it up as a carry forward agenda. We are dealing with it. In fact, bidding for, or countries applying for the pandemic fund is going to happen shortly. So there are health and other issues, financing of health and prevention of a pandemic and so on, issues which are now largely issues of concern for middle income and low income countries, because they don't have the resources either to buy vaccine or to build centers for testing and so on. So that is a classic example of issue which is pertaining to the South. It is an issue pertaining even to the much developed global North. But they have the funds to take care of it. They have the science which foundations which are doing research work into it, so they can. But the global South is the one which desperately needs that kind of help, and that agenda gets continued from Italy to Indonesia to India, and the fund is now getting operated. So the global voice is definitely, South voice is being given a very big place.
I could want to move now to your government's economic strategy. There are two principal pillars of it are, I would say, greater internationalization, because the economy has opened out more than ever before to international investment and to international, the free trade agreements are being negotiated with more than one country. In parallel, there is a determined attempt to build domestic capacities, Atmanirbhar Bharat as it's called, building manufacturing at home. How do we reconcile these two trends? Is there a contradiction? Is there a reconciliation? How will this play out?
Well, Ashok, there is just no contradiction at all. Atmanirbhar Bharat, when it was announced in 2020 during the pandemic, was also in a way a reform measure, where the country's foreign exchange should be spent for imports which are so required for your manufacturing as raw material or as intermediary. We will still continue to import. There are no duties levied on them. But actually, therefore, those goods which are being imported, which are consumer final products, which we don't need to import, or which are being manufactured in India. Maybe you want a better quality, you may get it, but nothing justifies at a time when you want to import raw materials and intermediary goods so that your jobs are saved, manufacturing happens, manufacturing not just for India but also for export needs to happen. We wanted to be sure that your Atmanirbhar Bharat is more towards encouraging manufacturing in India, services in India, and therefore not levied on goods which are required for these activities. But of course I'll stop goods which are coming, in fact which are flooding a market, for which we have enough producers. When at all, pray, will they reach the level of meeting your own demand? So Atmanirbhar Bharat is not to be misunderstood as a protectionist measure. It is protectionist to the extent that if you have consumer goods which are final products which are manufactured in India, I need to save those units which are producing in India. Toys are the best example. We were importing several toys. Today we are exporters of toys. That gives you jobs, that makes your India brand your products outside, and that which you need to import, particularly toys, particularly those luxury items, electronic goods and so on, which are also part of the toys basket, if I can loosely put it like that. Not all other electronic goods, I am not clubbing those. Toys related games and other things will have to pay some duty to come into the country. So we are very clear that item wise we are reviewing the situation and only then levying any duties. It's not protective in that sense.
Moving to a very important announcement you made in the midst of the lockdown, I remember. You spoke about rationalizing state-owned enterprises or public sector units, merging some of them, consolidating them, opening up more spaces for non-government companies in areas where they've been barred. Of course, in its extreme, this will lead to privatization. We've seen the example of Air India, which as a private company is showing great ambition. Could you take us through that roadmap, the consolidation of public sector companies, possible disinvestment, and so on?
That was very clearly stated in the policy of public sector enterprises in India. We have announced core sectors, 4 of them, and in that we said there will be at least a minimum presence of the government. But even they have been open for private sector. There is no sector now in India which is not available for the private sector to be in and function. And when we say a minimum presence of government in those core sectors, we mean that institutions which are big enough to run on their own steam will be there. But if there are others who are very small or unsustainable or not scalable, if there is a possibility, we will try to blend them so that a bigger unit, sustainable unit, a unit which can on its own take care of its needs, we will blend them and create a larger entity which can continue to be there. But if there are 2 small ones, and also small ones which cannot blend with the existing bigger one, we will try to see if there are others who would like to take them over, or if they are even not possible to be sold out, they will be shut. The policy is simply only that. It's not a crazy rushing out to sell everything, nor is it sitting and saying government will run the business of producing pins to aircrafts to everything. So where the government doesn't have to be, it won't. But where, because of strategic interests, you have to be, it will be there, like telecom, for instance. There will be a telecom company which will be government's, and it will be run professionally. So it's not as if the government is completely selling out everything. At the same time, it's also not as if it's going to be running all the businesses itself. But there is also that one point which you probably meant, is for those assets which exist, which are not being at the moment used properly, or which are not really optimally generating revenues, they will be monetized. And monetized is not to say I'm selling it off, not giving it for free for anybody, but a certain value is assessed, and what newly can it create in terms of earning by being used, by being put to some productive use, we'll encourage that. So asset monetization continues, and oftentimes our opposition, fully understanding the meaning, would still say, oh, you're selling that off. We are not selling that off. And timely just when I saw a member of the opposition come in.
Minister, one of the key agenda items of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's government in its 8 years, almost 9 years now, at international platforms has been a battle against tax avoidance, money laundering, illicit finance, terror financing, and other such areas. I have two questions for you here. One, is there greater international consensus and understanding on this than when we started this process in 2014? That's question one. Question two, has technology made the fight against such crimes easier, or has it enabled those crimes?
Well, yes, since 2015, when first time the agreement was signed for automatic exchange of information, which was signed in 15 but affected only from 17-18, I think, when automatic data sharing dumps of information reached us, electronic information reached us, and that is being very seriously studied in depth using technology. So technology is helping in that aspect, and information is also technology driven. Electronic information comes. It has helped us in identifying and greatly studying most of these accounts which have a potential that the laundering has happened. But first of all, everything which comes is not a black money or a money laundered account. There are genuine accounts as well. So it does take a time to understand and sieve those out and look at only those which are money laundered. So it's an intensive exercise. In that, the technology comes of greatly of use, and the artificial intelligence and the automated way in which you are able to detect those accounts which have many things to answer are the ones which are pursued as well. Globally, it has helped in terms of bringing consensus among nations that it is an important thing, and we are benefiting. I think about 98 countries with whom we have this exchange, and they also find the information we give them very useful. However, you're right in pointing out that technology and people who want to play on technology, misuse it, are also always ahead, and you're most often doing the catching up. So technology has both sides here.
My final question before I think we have one or two from the audience. India, as you've often said yourself, is a country that is industrializing at the same time at which it is fighting climate change and undergoing a energy transition. Climate finance, especially climate finance from global sources of capital, is key to this. It has been a concern of successive Indian finance ministers, including you during your term. Where are we at in this process? Is the world, are capital providers of the world more sensitive today, more willing today to invest, or is there still a gap?
At least the sense that I got in the G20 finance ministers meet was, yes, there is a greater readiness to take varying arguments. We did have a very detailed discussion, and also the chair's summary gives you a picture of the various options that are now available, which we want to capitalize on for both, that is for blended finance, public and private, and also the fact that the multilateral institutions also will have to very quickly come up with some kind of a understanding of how they want to fund countries in their climate transition efforts. Second is also looking at both adaptation and mitigation in climate related. There's also that readiness now to talk about both adaptation and mitigation. There's also, which I'm very pleased with, is the readiness to talk about climate related technology matters. So climate technology earlier used to be, you find the technology where it is available and you may want to buy it, no problem. But today now everybody is talking about technology, what kind of technologies, for what purposes, and for the countries which want to move out from coal to natural gas, or from gas from coal, and also transition if natural gas is becoming more expensive, how do you handle it, and so on. So I find that greater readiness to discuss in detail about climate changes and the requirement of the global south as regards per capita emission are all very well discussed.
Thank you so much. I'm afraid we are completely out of time. I'd like to hand you over to the organizers at ORF. Thank you so much, Minister Sitharaman, for your commitment to Raisina. We hope to have you back next year.
Thank you very much. Thank you.